to the House.
Call Carol Beaumont.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. It is a pleasure to rise and speak on the Victims of Crime Reform Bill, and I'm sure, as others have eloquently outlined already, we have no doubt over this side of the House, we are supporting this bill, and we have no doubt that the situation of victims in law and otherwise has greatly improved since Parliament first dealt with the issue in 1987. And as I said, we don't oppose this bill, but most of the evidence that we have seen indicates that the reforms that we'll enact will be helpful to a greater or lesser extent. But we do think there is the need to do more than just put in place further incremental change. And probably in no area is that more obvious than around victims of crime like sexual crimes and domestic violence, where there is a need to do a lot more than just put in place incremental change. And certainly in those types of crimes, so crimes against the person, very often crimes committed by somebody known to and in fact close to that person, and crimes that have significant costs to the individual, to their family, to our community and to our country, we need to be looking at whether there are fundamental changes that need to be made. Changes in terms of trying to prevent those crimes, changes in terms of how our police deal with those crimes, changes in how our court systems deal with that, and actually effectively acting in concert to make changes that are of a cultural nature, changes that actually mean that we have less victims of those crimes because we challenge and we get acceptance that those kinds of crimes are not acceptable in our community. And that starts by a recognition that we have a problem, that the level of offending in terms of sexual and domestic violence in this country is extraordinarily high, and that there is a culture of violence that we need to challenge. So the Justice and Electoral Select Committee, just going back to the basis of this particular bill, conducted an inquiry into victims' rights in 2007, which highlighted some of the issues that have finally been addressed by this bill. And as I recollect, in fact, I think that might have been Lynn Pillay actually chairing that inquiry, as I recall. Yeah, so that's how long this has been around, and so it's obviously taken quite some time to actually address the matters that are in this bill. And the Law Society has expressed some reservations about some of the initiatives presented by the government, particularly the expanding role of victims in the courtroom, which might move the courts away from the dispassionate dispensing of justice. However, they do support moves in the legislation to give adult victims the right to read their statements in court. And I do think that is an important thing, that victims of crime should have the right to have it made absolutely clear to all concerned the consequences and the impact that the crimes that have been perpetrated on them have actually had for them. Because often the consequences are very significant, and certainly I've been involved in the inquiry into funding for sexual violence services, and that select committee, the Social Services Select Committee, has heard submitter after submitter outline the consequences of crimes on those victims, and they traverse a whole range of different possibilities around, certainly around mental health issues, substance abuse, self-harm, and we had a very sad and moving submission from a police officer who came with a picture of his family, his wife and his children, and his wife had killed herself as a consequence of the crimes that were perpetrated against her and the fact that she was unable to get the support that she needed. So the consequences of crimes against a person can be very, very significant, and that sort of sexual and domestic offending has often additional harm caused because of the nature of the relationship between the person who has had the crime committed on them and the person committing the crime. So it is disappointing to us that if victims' rights are supposedly a priority of the government, that it took more than a year and a half since this bill came back from Select Committee for it to have a second reading, and that does seem an awfully long time if the concerns around victims were matters that were of serious consequence to the government. And I don't know. I don't know what the reason that was given for that was. Certainly, in our report back from the Select Committee, we noted that since 1987, this Parliament has dealt a number of times with the rights and interests of those who suffer as a result of criminal offending, and there certainly have been an attempt, certainly under Labor governments, to put in place initiatives to deal with crimes. Victim Offences Act 1987 and the Victims' Right Act 2002 were both Labor initiatives, and both adopted a broadly similar approach to this one, incremental amendment to the existing system to try and make it more responsive and more sensitive to the victims of crime and, of course, their families, because that's often also with the kind of offending I've talked about, the families are often the people who suffer as well. And in the example I gave with the police officer who came to our Select Committee, very clearly it was the family who ended up suffering. They were the ones who lost their mother, and in his case, his wife, and had to see her suffer for some considerable period of time before she did kill herself. And I mean, that's the extreme, obviously, but families also are victims of crime. And we certainly think that we need to look at things like our current adversarial criminal system, particularly whether there needs to be, in cases like sexual offending, a different sort of approach. And Labor, I think, will be much more interested in looking at the work that has been undertaken by the Law Commission in this regard. And while there are some fairly fundamental changes made, we do believe that this warrants investigation about how we do deal with getting to the bottom of the crime, getting to finding out the truth and obtaining justice for people. And let us not forget that in the end, with sexual offending, there is one conviction in every 100 cases. So there are a lot of people not being brought to justice for their offending. And that says a lot. It says a lot about the culture, and it says a lot about how difficult it can be for people to lay complaints, Mr. Speaker, but it also says that where they do, there are often then impediments for them continuing with that, impediments in terms of finding the evidence necessary, impediments about not wanting to go through our current adversarial system. And the fact of the matter is that people know, people hear about the way that people are treated in the court system, and it wasn't that long ago, within the last few months, that a Wellington defence lawyer said to a woman in a rape case, well, she should have kept her legs closed. Now, if people are going to be put through that sort of treatment in our court system, clearly it will put people off taking a complaint and pursuing their right for justice and their right to have the person who's perpetrated a crime on them held to account. So there are fundamental changes that we need to make to ensure that we change that kind of system. And we even have to look at the recent Roastbusters and the first report coming out of the Independent Police Complaints Authority, where this is supposedly around the communication. But what was the message sent to young women when you get a senior police officer standing up there saying, we can't do anything until somebody lays a complaint, when in fact some young women had made a complaint. They were being dismissed. They'd been brave enough to make that complaint, and then what they were hearing and what was going out into the public domain was that that complaint was dismissed. And so there is a real need, and while we support this bill, we do believe that it's incremental and does not go far enough to protect victims of crime.
Jamie Lee Ross.
I commend the bill to the House.
Members, this debate is concluded. The question is that the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it.
Victims' Rights Amendment Bill, third reading. Children, Young Persons and Their Families Amendment Bill number 4, third reading. Parole Amendment Bill number 2, third reading. Sentencing Amendment Bill number 2, third reading.
Members, the House stands adjourned until 2 p.m. tomorrow. Good evening.